Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining another episode of the Fikra podcast. Our special guest is Ruba Katrib, who is a curator at MoMA PS1 in New York. At MoMA PS1, she's curated exhibitions such as Greater New York, Theater of Operations, The Gulf Wars 1991 to 2011, co-curated with Peter Ely, the retrospective of Simone Fattal in 2019, as well as many, many others. And from 2012 to 2018, she was a curator at the Sculpture Center in New York, where she curated over 20 solo and group exhibitions. Previously, she was the associate curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Miami from 2007 to 2012, where she organized several solo and group exhibitions. Ruba has also co-curated the Site Santa Fe 2018 biennial Casa Tomada, along with Jose Luis Blondet and Candice Hopkins. Ruba, welcome to Fikra Conversations. I think I have to ask you to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Mikey.
Yeah, it's a thrill to have you. It's fun talking to curators. I like talking to curators because it's not clear to me how you approach your job. And it's not clear to me the moment at which a curator decides, oh, this is what I want to do. So when did you decide, like, oh, I want to be a curator? That's not something I think like 12-year-olds sort of think of.
No, and I did not know what a curator was, I think, until I became a curator. So I went to art school, actually, and coming from an immigrant family in the US, it's like there's like 3 careers that you can have, and no one was doing art or knew about art or interested in art in my family. But I was exposed to art, and through my grandparents who ended up living in Queens, and so I'd come visit them, and we would go, I would go to MoMA or go to the Whitney. But all I knew was there are artists out there and I want to be in this creative world. And so I should become an artist. So I went to art school, and curating was starting to become like more of a thing when I was in art school, but still not on people's radar, I think, as it is now.
Yeah. And
so I realized that I was actually more interested in other people's work than my own work. And what do you do if you want to be in this field? And it was really through a series of sort of accidents or encounters that led me to become a curator and to go to school for curating after undergrad.
Yeah. Do you feel like the primary role of a curator is to just make sense of things?
I think that's a good way of putting it. And it's really making sense of things. It's being an interlocutor between different arenas that may not always be aligned. So you're dealing with, the institution where you're working. Even if you're an independent curator, you have to work, you're working in a place, there's a physical location generally, communities, audiences, the artist, internal dynamics, external dynamics. So you're really moving between a lot of different people and constituents, wants, desires, demands, and you're trying to make sense of it and advocate for the best route forward for everybody.
Yeah. So you're saying that when you were in art school, this position became codified, this idea of a curator.
I was in art school in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And the sort of like global rise of the curator was, starting to happen in the 90s with the rise of biennials and things like that, international biennials. So it was sort of, more and more prominence was given to curators, but it was really like, I think in the early 2000s, that this sort of boom happened. Things have been building up from the 90s, really solidifying in the aughts. And I was in art school, and there was just never really talk about curators in art school. Like, it never actually came up, which is sort of wild to think about that as a young artist. And I actually ended up co-founding an artist residency and exhibition space, Threewalls, with some friends. And that was like kind of a complete accident. I had no idea what I was doing, and I was really young. And a friend had come into money. He was like a inheritance from his grandmother, and he wasn't even in the arts. He knew me, and he was like, "Oh, you're into art, right? Let's do this thing." And so it was really like just a few people who have no idea what they're doing, like starting an organization, and that's had a really long run actually. And I was only involved for the first couple of years, but that was really invaluable experience of like actually working with artists in residence and helping artists realize their visions via that avenue, but also then organizing an exhibition. So my first show was like a little group show in that space, and I think it was in 2003. And then I went to Mexico City, and like, you know, then I was like, oh wow, this is exactly what I want to do. And I've been doing it ever since.
Cool. So I want to focus, I told you this before starting the call, I want to focus on two of the sort of shows and subsequent books that you've been a part of. The one that focuses on the work of Simone Fattal, and the other which focuses on, whose name is Theater of Operations, the Gulf Wars, 1991 to 2011. Let's start talking a little bit about Simone. How did you come into knowing about, what was your first interaction with Simone Fattal's work?
I started seeing her sculptures in a few galleries, you know, a few at a time, small shows. She has a gallery in New York, Kaufman Repetto, that operates out of New York and Italy. So I saw some of her works there, and I just was really intrigued by them. And, you know, I knew a little bit of who she was, of course, but I, you know, didn't know about this artwork. And so I was curious what else there was. So, you know, what Simone had been showing really, and also she had a show in Sharjah. So she was, you know, around, but there was, her work piqued my curiosity. I was just like, what is this woman doing? Has she just started making these? Like, what else is there? And, you know, I knew her publishing house, Post Apollo Press. Mm-hmm. And it really was a conversation. You know, I reached out to Simone, I met with her, and I just asked her if she had more work. And she was like, oh yeah, I have a lot more work.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting because she had not had an institutional solo show in the US or really anywhere except for in Sharjah, and her exhibition history was spotty, right? So she'd have like some shows here and some galleries, but there was not like a consistent, I would say, exhibition history. And what I realized was that this is a woman who's been working for decades as an artist, since the 60s as an artist, and has an incredible body of work that she's built up. And we're seeing these sort of like snippets of it as a more emerging artist. And in doing the show at the museum, it was like, you know, do we do a small show to sort of introduce these works? But when I realized what she had, it had to be a retrospective. And so, yeah, you know, Simone Fattal having a retrospective after not really even having many shows at all.
So you said something interesting right now. You just said, of course, I was aware of her. Mm-hmm. Do you think most sort of casual, I mean, not to say that you're a casual a fan or lover of the arts of the Arab world, but do you feel like most people who say, oh, I love art from the Arab world or 20th century art from the Arab world, do you feel like they know who this person is?
Probably, maybe not. You know, I think what I realized is that Simone had some name recognition to me, and I knew a little bit of her work. Yeah. Her partner, of course, is Etel Adnan, who sadly just passed. Yeah. And Etel's, you know, career was, you know, launched while she was still, you know, in her late 80s, you know, and Simone's younger, but, you know, she's been in the arts, but they lived in the US for a long time. So I think that's something that I see that happens a lot in diaspora too, which is, and particularly with the Arab world, is that artists are in a, you know, moving around or moving into different communities. And so it's really hard to sustain that feeling of connection or belonging to two artist communities, or it becomes kind of dated, right? It's like who you knew in the 60s in Beirut. It's like a lot of really amazing people are 70s. And of course, Simone still goes back to Beirut all the time, but I mean, less now, but there's sort of that kind of idea of connection or continuity is a little bit more complicated. And they were living in California for a long time, and living in Paris then, and then still now living in Paris, and so I think that perhaps affected some of the sustained focus on Simone's work. But I can tell you that in doing the show, at the opening, Simone was came for the opening, saw the show. She really gave me carte blanche as a curator, which was such an amazing and daunting task. But all her friends came. She knows a million people. She's super social person, and has so many people respecting and admiring her, particularly through her work as a literary publisher. But they saw the show and they had no idea that Simone had done all of this. So I think that was really incredible. It was like a revelation for even her closest friends.
I've heard you say that before. What was her response? Was she kind of like befuddled? Like, I can't believe so many people love my work? Or was she like, yeah, of course it's amazing?
Maybe a little bit of both, but definitely like, of course it's amazing. And like, why?
What do you guys have in your storage units?
I know it was, I mean, and so, a lot of the comments I heard were people were like, I've seen Simone's work, like it's in the house, it's over here, I've seen the show, but they had no idea, like all of it, like that was my task, right? And that was the most brilliant and fun part of it, was like decades worth of work, how to make sense of it, how to introduce it, how to show her ways of thinking, how to tell the story. And so that was something I really had to deal with. So you could see like any one of these ceramics, like somewhere in someone's house, you're like, that's amazing. But it's actually like the world that she's created that I wanted to put forward. And all of these pieces play a part in this world, this huge world that she's created based on, literary figures, mythology, different archetypes. And so that's sort of how I devised of the relation, was really like emphasizing that part of her, looking like really historically, into the deep, into the past, but also of course, like thinking of the everyday and combining that. And so that was what my challenge was. And there were some pieces I was like, I must have this piece. And she was like, why do you want that? Like, it's not like a major piece, right? And I'm like, this idea of what a major piece, or that has to be big, or that, like what are the criteria when I'm seeing actually like the cloud sculpture she made, she's like, why do you want the sculpture, this ceramic piece of clouds? And I was like, it's perfect. It's like, you're building this environment, this world, and it plays a part in this. And I think that's actually like what the task of the show was. And I'm really feel very lucky that I was able to do that with her.
Can you talk about the meaning of the title, Works and Days?
Yes, it's a epic poem by Herzog, right? Hesiod. Sorry, you caught me.
But why does it? Aside from the source, like, why is it relevant? Why did it make sense? I'm always interested in titles.
It was really hard to come up with a title with her, tossing things around. She came up with it, and it's really like, I think she had a bunch of ideas, but this one really struck because it is, this Hesiod poem is really like about the kind of day-to-day. It's like a almanac, but it's an almanac like here, but with mythology tied in, and like the gods being, angry about this, and then how to like plant the seeds and harvest and the sort of season. So it's sort of taking in this like entire, it's like a how-to that I think gets to that kind of quotidian aspect of her work that also carries the mythological, also carries, these different archetypes, and sort of goes into the spiritual, into you know, the sort of basic necessities of life. Like some of her, the titles of her sculptures are so brilliant too. You'll just see like there's a lot of warriors, but then there's also like, you know, this is like man in his shadow, which I think is so brilliant on the head side. And then there's like horse, and then there's a wounded man, and there's like, you know, the poet, and sort of in the tours that I would give for the show, I would, you know, I've had all of the titles memorized of all the works. Now I do not, I've lost a little bit of that, but, you know, it was so much like just going through and like telling people the titles of the works, and this whole story emerged of like all these characters from, you know, the present and the past, and like coming together, and it's really tied to literature and writing and all of that. You know, yeah. Sorry.
When I'm always curious about, I mean, you said she gave you carte blanche, which is to say that you could use any of them, but could you also ascribe meaning to stuff that she didn't really see?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, she was, you know, making all of this, but she, yeah, I don't, you know, she had been showing the works really on these individual plinths. So it was like individual sculptures, you know, some of the painting she's shown, but not a lot of it. And the painting is just really, really incredible. And, you know, she stopped painting once she left Beirut.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. Why they go to San Francisco, and she stops painting. What's the reason there?
Well, so much of her painting is, a lot of it's dealing with like landscape. And I think a lot of the painting was like, it was like an act to do in Beirut during the war. Like you can make a beautiful painting, and there's a political act in that. But then they moved to Northern California in Sausalito, and it was like this beautiful place. And I think for her, she wasn't sure how to approach painting there. And then she started enrolling in some ceramics classes while they were living there, and starting to make all of these works, you know, started sort of making more like physical forms and like more hands-on. And I think, you know, she didn't make a series of black and white paintings later, but that was the only time she returned to painting.
Did you have a sense of what the relationship was like between her and Etel Adnan, aside from obviously lifelong partnership and the fact that Post Apollo Press was the publisher of Etel's work? But I'm curious, even as artists, did she also influence, I mean, she must have also influenced Etel Adnan's art as well? Like, did you get a sense about that stuff?
Yes, for sure. There was definitely, I think there's definitely a conversation, you know, and like definitely a cross influence. I mean, this is like a creative powerhouse duo. Yeah. And I think, you know, two women from the Arab world together as creative powerhouses, you know, they truly are trailblazers, and they were in it together. And I think that kind of like support between them was really key. I think, you know, Etel was older and, you know, becoming more established. And I think Simone, you know, is having, you know, since that show has been really having a moment, and like people are really looking at her work and understanding those relationships more. And I think that's super important to be happening. So I'm really happy about that.
Yeah. It must feel good to be like, I played some small part in that.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even believe it, but you know, I think that's something I'm really interested in, you know, in all of my work, which is, you know, seeing what's missing or what isn't being talked about, or an artist who's been working for decades and making all of this incredible work and being perhaps looked over. Why? You know, I think that's something that really drives me, and I'm always interested in doing my work, not the same shows that everyone else would be doing, right? So it's like I really am looking like at the cracks and what's in the cracks.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to transition somewhat abruptly to the other show that I'd love to really sort of dive into, Theater of Operations, The Gulf Wars, 1991 to 2011. You know, it's funny. I've heard you talk about this and really sort of talk about how, in many ways, this is kind of like the forgotten war. And at least I feel like the American conscience and the American story. I don't feel like people really talk about the wars of the 90s, and in particular the Gulf Wars. Why did you decide to look into this prism and to try to understand the world through this prism?
Well, this was a show, and I told Simone that I was formulating this and working on her show. She was like, "Why are you doing this to yourself?"
Yeah, why were you?
I think, you know, it's, again, looking at the cracks, and this is not really a crack because it's a huge fissure,
It's a crevice. Yeah.
It's a crevice, and it's in these wars, which are still ongoing, of course. You know, the dates are just the formalities of when the U.S.
When
government
you did that, yeah.
Yes, or they're saying like it starts now, it ends now. Like, what does that even mean? Just even having those dates doesn't. That's something we would kind of wanted to like underscore as like a sort of absurdity too. But this is a crevice, as you say, and something that was not, I felt, adequately acknowledged or addressed or understood as American history. And so the show happened, you know, here at PS1. I'm in the office at PS1 in Queens, and we're, you know, so of course it's a site-specific show. It's a show specific to the U.S. context. You know, I grew up during these wars. You know, I was impacted with the first Gulf War in 1991. I was very young, but all the stereotypes and sort of around Arabs and Muslims that were emerging then, you know, hit me, my family pretty hard, living in the US. And so that kind of, you know, rhetoric that had started before 1991, but like really amplified there, got even more intense with September 11th, et cetera. Like, this was something that I feel like defines American culture. If you go onto, let's say, like Netflix or Amazon Prime or something, just search Iraq War, and you're going to get hundreds of documentaries about it. How many Hollywood movies? You know, it's just like novels. There's a culture industry around these wars that's pretty much 100% from a Western perspective, or like, which I'm just saying here to mean like a sort of Euro-American perspective, but you know, there's also a lot of projects in the art world looking at the legacy of the Gulf War, the Iraq War. No one ever included an Iraqi participant. So there's a October Journal did an issue in 2008, I think, all about the Iraq War, and you have all these like theorists and philosophers and art historians talking about it. They don't even mention an Iraqi artist, right? So this idea of like, this is a place in the past, which is part of the justification for war and destruction anyway.
Yeah.
A cultural erasure that's happening of contemporary culture. Everyone's really interested in antiquities when it comes to Iraq, right? Like, this is an easy thing, or even the Arab world in general. Like, this is an easier thing.
It's digestible.
Exactly. Like, no one wants to talk about, you know, filmmakers, writers of the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, like musicians, like there's so much culture that is of now, and that it's being lost and displaced. And so there's basically, you know, the October Journal doesn't mention an Iraqi artist. They only have Zainab Bahrani is the only Iraqi contributor to that journal. So, and that persists today, right? So this is a show that was intended to, you know, bring in Iraqi artists and cultural producers with Western artists and cultural producers in a show that moved chronologically. So you see what's happened, you know, in the 90s with, you know, artists responding.
Before you keep on going, Ruba, I just want to say that I'm going to show some of the images on the screen. Some of them are quite alarming, as you would imagine visually. So if we have any sensitive viewers, please be advised. But keep on going.
Yes, so thank you for that. And I think it's really, this was something that was really important in talking about complex perspectives, the difference of responding from like here and there, and not that, again, not to sort of value one over the other, but looking at also, but trying to complicate responses, right? So how do you have like a really well-known Western artist making a work again? Most of all of the artists making work were making anti-war work, right? And then you have artists working within Iraq, part of the diaspora, and their perspectives are very different. So the idea was to really create like a more complex view of like these times and who was making work and who wasn't. There was one section that was really looking at the entire 90s, the period of sanctions against Iraq, and you only really have Iraqi artists making work because we're artists, in the Euro-American area, weren't part of the diaspora, like thinking about sanctions. No, it's, it's more like what was visible, what was made visible, what wasn't. And
can I ask about that visibility question for a second? Because going back to the question I asked at the beginning of like, what is your role as a curator, and this idea of trying to make sense of something. What struck me about this show and sort of the way it was put together was that it's as much about the theater as it is about the operations. And I never really put that together, that the Iraq War starting in 91 with the beginning of the beginning of 24-hour news media and CNN, that this was a theatrical event, a live theatrical event. And I kind of forgot that. I knew it some part of my brain was that this was a Hollywood show. And that because it was sort of theatrical and live streaming basically for the first time, it seemed to have drowned out any of the other voices that weren't plugged into cable television. But maybe I came away with the wrong message. But my question to you is, A, did I come away with the wrong message? Was that one of the key messages that you were trying to get across? And if it was it something that you knew before going into this? Were you aware of all these artists? Were you aware of that conclusion as a sort of going into the project, undertaking the project?
Yes, because I think, the first time this 24-hour news cycle is with the Gulf War. News media as we know it now was invented there. And with every new technology, there's new conflicts, right? So it's the first time there's a missile attached to a rocket. So you're getting this view from the missile, this idea like the empty desert, just explosions happening and these like abandoned sites. And for the Gulf War, it was all about new technology and this kind of precise war that would reduce the amount of unnecessary casualties, et cetera. Of course, this is all garbage. And, it's the first time there's depleted uranium used, and that depleted uranium is still there. It's going to be there for millennia. And so there's an environmental impact. There's such a huge impact, and it's all about, a human capacity for understanding what's happening. And I think the media, technology, art, culture plays a role in how people can understand what's happening and the impact of what's happening. And I think that's the battleground. And I think, there's an art's role in sort of changing that narrative or bringing attention to certain things. And for this show, this is one of the few shows that I've done where it's like not about taste or like what I like as a curator. And like, I think that was also really hard for people to understand. Like, this is a historic show. There's a lot of art works that I don't necessarily agree with or like, but we put it out there for viewers to see it and see it together and see the conflicts and conversations between the works that were created, where there was affinities, where there was discord, where there were, inabilities to comprehend what was going on, where there was a, more emotive response. Like all of that together was really key. Like the more clinical approach that a lot of artists had, the more emotive approach that artists that were directly impacted were having, and the value system that's put on those kinds of work, right? More conceptually oriented work that's more like analytical is somehow more advanced than perhaps like someone like Dia, who's like working really emotively from a place of connection, you know, making incredible works. But yeah, how do you put some, you know, for us, it was very interesting to look at Jean-Luc Moulin and Dia El-Azawi, like all together at the same time, making such different works, but grappling with their own perception and experience and trying to say something and how they were doing that. And what was a challenge though with this exhibition was realizing that so many people do not know about these wars. Yeah. You know, even like staff at the museum who are really young definitely don't know about the Gulf War, and some don't even know about the Iraq War. And we had a lot of student groups coming. They also, you know, all of this was news to them, a lot of it, or they faintly heard of it. And that was also really shocking to me, that like Iraq and you know, the Iraq War and even the Gulf War a little bit have become these tropes in the popular imagination. It's in video games, it's like everything in American culture, but there's really a lack of information and understanding. So that became you know, something we really had to do, which was sort of even explain again, like, where is Iraq? Yeah. And like, you know, getting onto the more complex level, but then being able to be like, allowing people to understand. Are you having
yeah, I'm in Beirut, so
got an outage. Yeah. But yeah, you know, like, how do you understand these really complex issues and then get the basic information across too, without like seeming overly didactic or like, I don't know, that was really tough for me, because I you know, definitely knew a lot more, or, you know, I've been thinking about this and researching it, but a lot of the audiences, a lot of these student groups, you know, this was fascinating for them to learn about, and it's not taught in school. You know, it's interesting, like the Vietnam War is this American-led disaster that is, you know, perhaps part of history, but American history. But I think what's interesting is like the Iraq War and even the Afghanistan War, you know, it's something in the news, but it's not actually like being taught.
Well, because what's interesting is that I feel like in 2003, with George W. Bush, that invasion, I mean, I didn't live in the US in 91. So I don't remember what that discourse was really like. But in 2003, it seemed like 100% of people in the US felt like it's time to invade Iraq. That's what it felt like as somebody who was about to move to the States.
There were a lot of anti-war protests.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of popular support too. And I think something that I was really interested in, or felt like was really important with this show, is to link the wars and the sanctions, because I think that's something that, you know, was also seen when organizing the show as controversial. Like, these are two separate things. Why are you combining them into one? And of course, there's a bigger, you know, American agenda, like geopolitical agenda, but it's not just American. There's a, you know, it's with Britain, et cetera. Like, this isn't like, there's a strategy here, right? And so, you know, the Gulf War really debilitated Iraq, but then the 10 years of sanctions knocked Iraq on its knees. And then you have the 2003 war, and the US is bombing Iraq throughout the 90s. So it's not just like this war ended neatly, it's done. Then, you know, another war happens. It's actually part of a longer strategic agenda within the region, and all of this is you know, done in that for that vision, and so the dates, you know, we wanted the end date of 2011 doesn't make any sense really, but we wanted to hyphenate and connect 1991 with 2011 as like, this is a continuous engagement in Iraq by the US and its allies. And I think, you know, something else that was really key was like, what, you know, these countries that are benefiting from this war, this is where, these are the countries where the art worlds are thriving too.
Yeah.
And so something else that was really interesting to me was looking at, the participation, global participation of Iraqi artists. And I define Iraqi artists as people like, in this context, like, born in Iraq and moved, part of the diaspora or lived in Iraq for some period of time. Of course, that definition can be much broader, but just for the purpose of like this impact. But I was, they're not in international shows. They're not in these international biennials, often held in countries that have benefited and are involved in this war in Iraq. So this idea of a global fluidity and equal access and participation in a global art world, to me, is a complete lie and a myth. And this show was meant to underscore that, because you have all of these artists that are Iraqi artists that can have really important perspectives and a lot to say and amazing work. And they're not, being called upon to do that.
So you're trying to like underscore this point, right? Just as Ruba, how do you know if that lands?
I don't think it,
how do you digest the reaction yourself,
For me, it's really talking to people.
Yeah.
So we had a lot, like the impact. I was giving a tour 3 times a week to university students. And that for me was really important, because those conversations were so essential. So many students were writing papers about this show. It really blew their minds, I think, as young people, which I think was interesting. Then there was a sort of like more jaded older audience. I was like, oh yeah, I know all about this. I've been here. Like, you didn't get this right. That, I recall it like this, and that's another factor. But for me, it was more reaching young people who didn't know about any of this. And that was really key. And then also, of course, the art world, I feel like part of what I wanted to do is just, there's many art worlds, but I hope now curators will call up a broader range of Iraqi artists and they look deeper and understand that, because what tends to happen in the art world is you get like one representative of a region or a country or whatever. And I think that's highly problematic, and there should be more participation, and other curators need to, support these artists. So
is there a group text you can just message?
If only, but I think people really looked at the show. The catalog was successful, I think, and it got people to look, more at artists like even like Nuha Al-Radi. Hana Malala. Like, there's so many incredible artists. But I think what happens in New York, like in the U.S. and in New York, is there is this kind of like myopic view, or like, the artists who are more famous and more recognized, of course, get more recognition and I definitely, it's more familiar, right? So it's always harder. It's always a bigger challenge to introduce unfamiliar artists, unfamiliar names, unfamiliar ideas into the mix. But this was a gesture towards that, an attempt to do that. But
have there been any, so this show was in 2012, right? Or was there?
No,
2017.
2019.
2019.
Yeah, let me check, because it's 2019.
No, I think you're right. 2019.
Yeah, it's like all a blur now.
Yeah, exactly. Has there been any thought put into the idea of sort of taking it on the road, or what would it look like if it was ported into a European context or into a GCC context, or into the context into the broader Middle East?
I think there's some interest. I think there was some interest, but it was a really hard show to put together. And I have to tell you that, we were able, this is, a nice thing about being in an institution of this scale, which is like, and this was like our big show of the year. So we were able to put all of our resources into it. And yeah, I mean, it was just tracking down these works, getting them here. It was.
How did you find them?
I mean, we did a few research trips. I wasn't able to go to Iraq, but did a few research trips, and a lot of the artists live other places, like in London.
Yeah.
Or, you know, Kareem, my son, lives outside of Toronto, so I visited him there. So that kind of diaspora that, you know, so such a big part of this, you know, forced diaspora. It was, you know, I was meeting artists elsewhere, asking artists like who they knew, what they thought. There's a informal group of advisors that were, you know, working on helping me with the catalog, writing for the catalog, but, you know, agreed to give a lot of advice and resources to help this project. So a lot of people, you know, have done a lot of work around this issue. So it wasn't like I was starting from zero. So I was able to call upon people to come to my aid and like Nada Shabud or Zainab Bahrani and like, and contribute their scholarship and research. But I think, but yeah, artists helped me because a lot of this has been written down. So who did they think was important or interesting? And so that was part of the research process. For the Western artists in the show, the Euro-American artists, my criteria was that the work had to have been shown before. It was a historical view. So it was like, this was a show that has been exhibited. It's not made now for this context to respond now. The show is a record of responses over the last few decades to these various conflicts, and we see what people thought then or what they made then. So that has, and it had to be like for the most part shown. For the Iraqi artists and even the Kuwaiti artists in the show, like that was impossible to make as a requirement, but it was mostly historic work that maybe had not been shown, but was historic. A couple new things that were made.
Can you tell the story about this one? Because this clearly was not shown, this Leila Attar piece.
The painting was shown.
But wasn't it unfinished when you came across it?
We showed it unfinished.
Okay.
Because we found her son who lives in Canada. And so going to a lot of family members, going to people's houses, a lot of like Nuha Al-Radi's work was in New York in the Upper East Side because some friends and family were here. So I was going to people's houses and dragging out these works that everyone would think would be in Iraq or Beirut. There's more in Beirut, but like, the Leila Attar that was found through her son. So yeah, it was kind of like a lot of these works are in people's houses. So like finding them and bringing them out. So I think that was an enormous feat. And also like it took resources. So a lot of our efforts were put there. And I don't think another institution would do that, honestly.
I'd be so curious to see what the response would be like if it was shown in the GCC or in the rest of the Arab world. I think it would be a really, really, really powerful, very, very powerful thing.
Me too. I wish it could be, I wish that could happen, because I think also how a lot of the Western artists are seen would be totally different too.
Completely different.
Like that perspective would be shifted. Like, I mean, it's sort of like half show, like, and how that half is recognized. And I think like, you know, the style of working is so different too. Cause I think something else is like, you know, it's like thinking of, I don't know, it's just, the way the artists work, the histories that are evoked, the language that's there, like the reference points would be totally different. And I think people would get it totally differently. Yeah,
I agree. Okay, I'm going to do this quick Q&A before we open up to everybody. Ruba, what are you reading or watching right now?
What am I reading or watching right now? I don't really watch television.
Sure. Fair.
But I do watch Succession.
You're like, but obviously.
But I'm kind of disappointed in the last season. And I'm reading...
national duty to watch Succession.
I've kind of been reading a lot of Dennis Johnson books right now. just sort of for pleasure, which is not related to any research, and about to dig into a big chunk of research for an upcoming show.
Cool. Can you disclose or you can't disclose?
I guess I can't disclose because it hasn't been announced yet, okay. But also thinking an artist from the Arab world. So
cool.
Yeah.
Exciting. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Who would I love to shadow for a day? This is a tough one.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just go for Etel Adnan in the past.
Sure. While she's painting or while she's writing?
I think, but I would just love to see her, like, you know, in the 70s. What was she doing? How was she living her life? She was such an incredible thinker, and like, you know, just how did she do it?
Cool. What do people most misunderstand about your work, or I guess your line of work?
I think I'm a really critical person. Maybe that's why the shadow part is hard for me too, because I'm not like a fan. And I think curating is not about being I mean, for some people it is, but I'm not just like loving everything, loving everyone.
Yeah, I mean, for some people it very much is.
It is. Yeah, it's like, this is stuff I like. These are things I like. And for me, I'm really critically looking at everything. I'm really skeptical too, and analyzing everything. And I think that's a key part of my work and how I do it. You know, even when I'm working with an artist really closely, it's never just like, you know, it can be a really intimate, generative experience. And I have like so much respect for people, but it's also like, yeah, there's arguments, there's there's disagreements, there's different visions. It's about, for me, it's a little bit about that tete-a-tete, like going at it, being invested in the project, like thinking critically, helping artists think critically too about their own work, thinking critically about the work I'm doing. I think that's the most misunderstood thing. It's like, yeah, it's not just like I'm filling a museum with things I love.
Yeah, it's like it's like there are four entities. There's you, there's the artist, there's the art, and then there's the dissection and thing that you're creating that's supposed to be making sense of the art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes I'm like not 100% sure about something, and I'm like working on it to work through it, and so yeah, it's to me, that's the risk-taking part of what I do, which is like, it's not necessarily like a safe bet, right, all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, outside your profession, whose work do you inspires you?
I'm really interested in, like, not someone's work necessarily, but really looking at like music a lot right now. And my husband actually runs a nonprofit focused on experimental music. And it's really interesting for me to be in those circles because, I see how, there's more of like an intergenerational connection, I think, within music. And I think the commitment musicians have to their practice, and like also the attention span it takes to like listen to music or see live music or or be in that space. Sometimes when it can be really challenging too. I find that to be a really refreshing and regenerative place compared to art, where you can like be in an opening and just talking to people, not even looking at what's there. So I think people that have that kind of intense focus and attention is really special to me. Yeah, and I think that's really important. And also people who are doing a lot of humanitarian work too, I'm really inspired by. I'm on the board of an organization called Basme Zaytoune, And, they're working in Lebanon with Syrian refugees. And I think, it's great to be involved with them, but of course I'm not like on the ground. I think that what they do is really exciting and important, and those kinds of projects are really inspiring.
Cool. Okay, we got 2 questions so far. The first one comes from Shahade.
Am I supposed to speak now?
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, Ruba. It's Sade.
How are you?
Good. It's funny. We've known each other for over a decade, and it's the first time I'm listening to you talk about your work focused on the Middle East. So this was super fun. So Ruba, as you were kind of like digging into the Iraq exhibition and all the research you did, what I thought was interesting is I'd love to hear if you sensed when you started doing your research, was there a turning point after the 91 war and that era, the Gulf War? Because it would have been right around when the Iran-Iraq war, which was 8 years. And to this day, half of the artists you and I both know, and we've been to their exhibitions in New York and everywhere else, you know how much it's influenced the millennials of Iran and their work that's still being produced in New York and beyond. The Iran-Iraq war is so alive and present in their work. I've never really, and what you made me think of is like, I've never thought about the lens from the other angle, meaning the Iraqi angle. So what kind of an influence was there? Did it impact the art world there and what was produced during that time? Or was it just kind of just like a steady stream? And then all of a sudden in the 90s, you saw this shift and growth and change in the way that the artists were interpreting things and creating art. And that's why you focused on this era.
Yeah, I think that's, the Iran-Iraq war, like a lot of the artists in the show, actually, some of them were conscripted into that war. And someone like Dia actually left Iraq because he was going to have to serve in the military. And so I think that's definitely present within a lot of the artist experience. And I think it was interesting looking at artists writing, in the 50s or 60s that were saying, or actually, sorry, it was one of the artists writing right at the start of the Iran-Iraq war, who was like completely like shocked that war would be coming to the region. And I'm blanking on, it was in one of the Dafatir, so I'm actually blanking on who it was, but it was really incredible to read that and see like, now a place that is so associated with war, the kind of enormous shock that something like this would be happening, because only in Europe has there been like war, like World War II, et cetera. So that was really interesting to read. And, I think it definitely impacted a lot of artists, but for the sake of the show, I kind of had to just keep it as, even though it's a really big view, like start it at 1990 for the Gulf War.
The last question comes from Marianne. Marianne, if you want to just unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. I'm glad. My question had to do with if there were other cracks that you were looking at within American life or within what I would call the nostalgia of Arab American life that might be worthwhile as topics. I'm just I'm just curious what else you're thinking about, and I'd appreciate that.
Well, I'm definitely, I think Israel-Palestine is another crack.
Never heard of it.
And I think that's, and that's sort of something I'm working on with an artist that will be forthcoming, and, looking, finding ways to normalize conversations around, Palestine within arts institutions in the US is really challenging. And, something that I've been thinking about and working on for a long time. But, I think this next project I'm very excited about because it's talking about ideas specific to Palestine, but of course have huge global impacts and are based on I think shared experiences that can be more broadly felt. Because I think that's also something that, with the Iraq War was really key. Was, I'm thinking about the Gulf War and Iraq War was just like how to sort of take things that are happening in one place, but actually show, specificities of that place, but also show how there's parallels in other places and make it more relatable so that there isn't this idea of division when we're looking at certain regions, certain topics, certain issues, but in fact, a feeling of togetherness and bigger, goals for where we want, society and humanity to go and how we want people to be able to live. So I think that's something that is really key, but there's so many, I think there's not a great education about the Arab world or even Arab Americans or anything. So it's in the US, from the US context. So I think that's something that there's so much work to be done to raise awareness and have more access and information. And I think Africa is doing that too, contributing to that. So I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation and contribute something to it.
Amazing. Ruba, thanks so much for doing this. I feel like I learned so much about the world from your work. And so thanks for giving us some of your time.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. We're going to have events, as always, almost every day. So go to the website, check all that stuff out. This will go up on the podcast feed in a few days. So when it's up there, share it with some friends who may have missed today's talk, and see you next time.